In the summer of 1973, a low-budget science fiction film slipped into theaters and quietly unsettled everyone who saw it. It was made in 30 days, shot on borrowed sets, and starred one of the biggest names in Hollywood playing a machine with almost no lines. Most people never knew the half of what went on behind the camera. These are Westworld, 1973. 15 secrets hidden for decades. Secret 15, the alternate ending, Crichton filmed and then buried. The version of Westworld that reached theaters in August 1973 ended with Peter Martin, played by Richard Benjamin, destroying the gunslinger by throwing acid on him and then setting him on fire. It was a lean, grim finish, and it worked. But it was not the ending Michael Crichton originally wrote or filmed. In Crichton's assembly cut, the final confrontation between Peter and the gunslinger was a full physical fight. It ran longer, it was more violent, and it ended with the gunslinger being destroyed not by acid and fire, but by the medieval torture rack, the same device used earlier in the film to kill one of the park guests. Crichton had liked that idea. He later wrote that he was drawn to the image of a complex machine being destroyed by a simple machine. It had a poetic logic to it, the park's own instruments of cruelty turning on the thing the park had created. But when he shot the sequence, something didn't work on screen. He later described it as looking staged and foolish, and he cut it. The rack death went with it. What also disappeared from the theatrical cut was a scene showing the gunslinger at a sink, washing acid from his face before resuming the hunt. A quiet, methodical moment that underlined what he was. Not panicking, not in pain, just cleaning himself off and continuing. That scene was restored in the NBC television broadcast in 1976, which also added extended technician dialogue and hovercraft exterior footage. The rack ending never appeared in any version. It was not in the television cut, not in any home video release, and not in any international print that has been documented. Crichton's own written account of it remains the primary source. He described the fight, the rack, the poetic logic he had liked, and then explained why he cut it. The image of that ending exists only in his description of it, buried for more than 50 years. Secret 14. Every major studio passed on the script.
What kind of gun belt did you have the last time? I had the one without the strings. And you could draw fast? Maybe it doesn't matter after all.
Before Westworld landed at MGM, Michael Crichton shopped the screenplay to every major studio in Hollywood. Every one of them turned it down. This was 1972. 4 years before Star Wars reshaped Hollywood's appetite for science fiction, and the studio system was not particularly enthusiastic about the genre. MGM was the only taker, and it came with complications. The studio had a well-earned reputation for interference, arbitrary rewrites, and recutting finished films without the director's consent. Crichton later wrote that nobody who had a choice made a picture at MGM at that time, but he did not have a choice. MGM demanded script changes right up to the first day of shooting. The lead actors were not signed until 48 hours before cameras rolled. Crichton had no control over casting. MGM had initially agreed to make the film for under $1 million and only increased the amount by $250,000 later. Given all of that, the fact that the film came out coherent and effective was its own kind of achievement. Secret 13. The leads were cast 48 hours before filming began.
What do we do now? Well, the way I figure it, anything we want. There's no law in that town now, I'll say. We go in there, we do anything we want.
The casting chaos that surrounded Westworld is one of the stranger production stories of the era. Richard Benjamin and James Brolin, the two guests at the center of the story, were not confirmed in their roles until 2 days before principal photography started. Crichton had no say in who was cast. MGM retained full control. Pre-production had begun in November 1972, with shooting scheduled to begin shortly after. Crichton spent those weeks building sets, locking locations, and preparing a plan to finish in 30 days. But the people he would be filming had not yet been officially hired. Richard Benjamin had been working steadily through the early 1970s, most recently in Portnoy's Complaint in 1972. James Brolin was coming off a long run on Marcus Welby, MD. The last-minute confirmation meant virtually no rehearsal time before cameras rolled, and the production's already compressed schedule left no margin for adjustment. Secret 12. MGM never screened the film for critics.
What's he in for?
Central malfunction.
Another one?
The studio's lack of confidence in Westworld extended all the way to its release strategy. MGM did not screen the finished film for professional film critics before it opened. The standard practice at the time, and still today, was to hold press screenings ahead of a theatrical release, give critics enough time to write their reviews, and let that coverage either help or hurt the opening weekend. MGM skipped that entirely. Instead, the studio invited members of the general public to a test screening and handed out response cards asking them to rate their experience. Crichton waited anxiously for the results. When they came back, 95% of the cards had the words good or excellent written on them. The audience reaction was described as ecstatic. Based on that response, MGM agreed to release the film properly rather than quietly dumping it into limited distribution. The film opened in August 1973 and became MGM's biggest box office success of the year, earning $10 million against a budget of $1.3 million. The studio that had spent the entire production expecting a disaster watched it become the most profitable thing they released that year. Secret 11. Yul Brynner was broke and took the role for $75,000. Yul Brynner was one of the most recognizable stars in Hollywood in 1973. He had won an Academy Award for The King and I in 1956. He had led The Magnificent Seven in 1960. His face was iconic. The shaved head, the physicality, the absolutely still intensity that came through a camera like almost nobody else in his generation. And by the early 1970s, he was in serious financial trouble. Brynner had renounced his dual American citizenship years earlier in a move tied to complicated tax and financial issues involving claims he had made regarding time spent outside the United States. The fallout left him in a precarious financial position, and when the role of the gunslinger came along, he accepted it for $75,000. According to producer Paul Lazarus III, Brynner needed the money. That context adds something to the performance. A man who had played kings and warriors for decades, now stepping into a role with almost no dialogue, no character arc, and no conventional dramatic material to work with, for a fee that represented a significant step down from his peak earning years. What Brynner did with those constraints was quietly extraordinary. He built the gunslinger entirely out of physical presence and a quality of absolute mechanical intent that required him to suppress every instinct a performer develops over a lifetime. The result is a character who reads as inhuman, not because he moves stiffly, but because something in the way he carries himself operates on a slightly different frequency than anything human. Secret 10. A blank cartridge blinded Brynner mid-production and halted filming.
What's his problem?
Nothing. He got shot up today, so we're taking the opportunity to replace the visual cortex.
About 2 weeks into the 30-day shoot, disaster arrived in a form no one had anticipated. During a shootout sequence, a piece of wadding from a blank cartridge hit Yul Brynner directly in the eye. The wadding scratched his cornea. The injury was not severe enough to require hospitalization, and Brynner shrugged it off in the way that performers of his generation typically did, stoically, without making a scene. But the damage had a specific and unavoidable consequence. The silvered metallic contact lenses that gave the gunslinger his inhuman gaze became impossible to wear. Every time Brenner tried to put them in, the injured eye teared up and turned bright red, ruining the effect completely. The production had no choice but to restructure the shooting schedule around Brenner's recovery. On a 30-day schedule with no slack, that kind of interruption was a serious problem. Crichton and his team rearranged what they could, shooting scenes that didn't require Brenner's eyes to be visible, and waited. The eye healed, the contact lenses went back in, and the production continued. Secret 9. The acid scene used Alka-Seltzer on Brenner's face. The moment in Westworld where Peter Martin throws acid on the gunslinger's face is one of the film's most visually striking sequences. The gunslinger's skin visibly fizzes and corrodes on camera. The effect looked genuinely disturbing in 1973, and it still does. The process behind it was considerably less frightening than the result. Yul Brynner's face was coated with an oil-based makeup that had ground Alka-Seltzer tablets mixed into it. When a splash of water hit the surface, the bicarbonate in the Alka-Seltzer reacted with moisture and began fizzing on contact, creating the appearance of acid eating through flesh. The makeup team had to apply the mixture carefully and time the water splash precisely because the reaction happened quickly and couldn't be sustained for long. The result was captured in the single take that made the final cut. It was the kind of low-budget practical ingenuity that defined filmmaking in the early 1970s, when budgets were small and crews had to find solutions that looked expensive for almost nothing. Secret 8. The Western Street was later used in Blazing Saddles. The outdoor Western Street that served as the primary exterior location for Westworld was not a set built for the production. It was an existing backlot facility, specifically the Western Street on the Warner Brothers backlot, according to a 1973 article in American Cinematographer. The Roman world sequences were filmed at the Harold Lloyd Estate in Beverly Hills, with its classical architecture providing the film's ancient Roman environment. The Mojave Desert and Sherwood Lake Ranch provided additional location shooting. The Warner Brothers Western Street used for Westworld appeared again the following year in Mel Brooks' Blazing Saddles, which came out in 1974. The shared geography of those two films, one a straight-faced thriller about killer robots, the other a satirical comedy dismantling every Western cliché in existence, is one of the more quietly amusing coincidences in 1970s film history. The same dirt roads and wooden storefronts that the gunslinger stalked through while hunting Peter Martin were being used for comic gunfights and pratfalls just months later. Secret 7. Crichton got the idea from NASA astronauts and Disneyland.
Strike their colors, you razor witch. No need to expose your superstructure.
The origin story behind Westworld is not what most people expect. Michael Crichton did not arrive at the concept by reading science fiction novels or watching old robot movies. The idea came from two specific observations that he combined into a single disturbing thought. The first came from a visit to NASA's Kennedy Space Center, where Crichton watched astronauts being trained. What struck him was how rigorously those men were being conditioned to suppress their human responses, to make their reactions as predictable and machine-like as possible. The training was designed to eliminate improvisation, to reduce uncertainty, to ensure that in any situation, the astronaut would respond the way a reliable machine responds. They were people working very hard to function like something other than people. The second observation came from Disneyland, where Crichton was struck by the animatronic figures in attractions like Pirates of the Caribbean. Machines designed to move and behave with something approaching human naturalness. Two trends, running in opposite directions. Humans being trained toward mechanical reliability, machines being engineered toward human expressiveness. Westworld was where Crichton let those tendencies collide. Disney World in Florida had opened just 2 years before the film, in October 1971, which placed the concept squarely inside a moment when Americans were experiencing exactly the kind of engineered fantasy environment Crichton was writing about. Secret 6. The gunslinger's costume was deliberate. Brenner wore his magnificent 7 outfit.
You spared my life once. Now I'm going to save yours. Take your vaqueros and ride out of here. Ride out and don't look back.
The black hat, black shirt, and black gun belt that Yul Brynner wears throughout Westworld are not generic Western wardrobe. They are the exact same costume Brynner wore as Chris Adams in The Magnificent Seven in 1960. The choice was intentional, and the reasoning behind it went deeper than visual shorthand. Crichton explained it directly. If someone were actually going to build the Delos theme park, they would design the gunfighter robot to look like the most iconic gunfighter in popular memory. In 1973, that was Yul Brynner as Chris Adams. His image had become, in 13 years, the definitive Hollywood Western gunslinger. By putting Brynner in that same costume and revealing him to be a machine, Crichton transformed something audiences already trusted into something fundamentally wrong. The familiarity was the source of the dread. Crichton later said he had not cast Brynner himself. The studio made that decision, but he was glad they did, and the costume choice was something they agreed on completely. Secret 5. The CGI robot POV was invented for this film. Westworld was the first feature film in history to use digital image processing as a visual effect. The pixelated, grid-like shots representing the gunslinger's machine vision, the way he sees Peter Martin and the world around him as a blocky, electronic map, were something that had never been attempted in a motion picture before. Today, those images look like early video game graphics. In 1973, they looked like something genuinely alien. Crichton had initially approached the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena about creating the effect. The estimate came back at $200,000 for 2 minutes of footage, with a 9-month timeline, neither remotely workable for a $1.3 million film on a 30-day schedule. Crichton then reached out to experimental filmmaker John Whitney Sr., who directed him to his son, John Whitney Jr. Whitney Jr. took the project to Information International, Incorporated, where he and Gary Demos worked at night to keep costs manageable. The process involved color separating each frame of the source footage, scanning the elements into pixel blocks, and recombining them with color added back in. Testing the process alone took more than 2 months before the team was confident enough in the results to proceed. Once it was working reliably, each 10 seconds of finished footage required 8 hours to produce. The final cut contained approximately 2 minutes and 31 seconds of the pixelated effect across 14 shots in the film. Crichton later noted that the look was remarkable in 1973 and had become a visual cliché by 1980, appearing in perfume advertisements and everywhere else. But in the summer of 1973, no one sitting in a theater had seen anything like it. Secret 4. Crichton was depressed by his own first cut and recut the film himself.
Pass down the hall. That'll cost you 2 bits for hot water. Dinner at 7, breakfast at 6:30. Eat lunch on your own.
When Michael Crichton sat down to review his assembly cut of Westworld, he was not pleased with what he saw. He later described finding the rough cut too long and, in places, genuinely boring. The budget limitations had hurt the dramatic impact of some sequences, and the film, as first assembled, did not have the momentum he was looking for. He went back into the editing room and substantially reworked the cut himself, making decisions that in some cases went against what he had originally planned. The final theatrical version ran 88 minutes, a lean runtime that reflected Crichton's willingness to cut anything that slowed the pace, regardless of how much he had liked the idea of it on paper. The bank robbery sequence was removed. The sales room scenes went. The hovercraft opening, which Crichton had planned to show with full-screen model shots, was replaced by television-style monitor images because the model footage hadn't come out convincingly. The fight and rack ending was abandoned. What remained was a film that established its world efficiently, built its dread carefully, and then became a chase picture for its final third. Even after all that work, Crichton was not entirely satisfied with the audience response. He later said he believed the film had been misunderstood, that most viewers took it as a warning about technology, while he had intended something more interested in human behavior than in machines. He felt people came out talking about the robots when he had meant for them to think about what the park said about the people who paid to visit it. After the film's release, Crichton stepped away from science fiction for 5 years. Secret 3: Majel Barrett was in the cast. One of the more quietly notable pieces of casting in Westworld involves an actress who was known, at the time, to a very specific and very devoted audience. Majel Barrett played Miss Carey, the Madam of the Saloon in Westworld. Barrett had spent years playing Nurse Christine Chapel in the original Star Trek television series, which had run from 1966 to 1969. She was also the voice of the computer in the Star Trek universe, a role she would reprise across multiple series over decades, and she was the wife of Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry. For the science fiction audience of 1973, seeing Majel Barrett show up in Westworld as a saloon madam running a brothel staffed by android women was a casting surprise with an extra layer to it. She was the human voice of a fictional computer appearing in a film about computers going wrong. Whether that was intentional or coincidental on Crichton's part is not documented, but it has not gone unnoticed by the people who have watched the film closely over the 50-plus years since its release. Secret 2: The sequel was made without Crichton, and he had no involvement.
John, this place is really fun.
The financial success of Westworld made a follow-up almost unavoidable. Future World arrived in 1976, produced by American International Pictures rather than MGM, directed by Richard T. Heffron, and written by Mayo Simon and George Schenk. Michael Crichton was not involved in any capacity. The film was made for $2.5 million and earned $4.2 million in domestic theatrical rentals, a lower return than its predecessor. Yul Brynner returned briefly in a dream sequence cameo with no logical connection to the original character's story. It was his last screen role before his death from lung cancer in October 1985. Critics largely dismissed it for lacking the tension that had made the original work. Beyond Westworld, a CBS television series, followed in 1980 and was canceled after just 3 of its 5 produced episodes aired. Secret 1: The film directly inspired Jurassic Park, and Crichton admitted it.
They'll capture the imagination of the entire planet.
And extinction is a thing of the past.
Welcome to Jurassic Park.
Michael Crichton used essentially the same premise twice. A technologically sophisticated entertainment facility built to give wealthy guests an experience beyond ordinary life, staffed by artificial creations designed to be safe and entertaining, suffers a catastrophic systems failure that leaves those creations uncontrolled and lethal, and the humans inside with no way out. The first time was Westworld in 1973. The second time was the novel Jurassic Park, published in 1990 and turned into Steven Spielberg's film in 1993. Crichton acknowledged the connection directly. The underground control center in Westworld, with its technicians watching monitors and trying to contain a crisis they no longer have the tools to manage, maps almost perfectly onto the control room scenes in Jurassic Park. The logic of the malfunction is identical in both stories. A system too complex for the people who designed it to fully understand, reaching a point where it stops doing what it was built to do and starts doing something else entirely. The major variables are different: robots instead of dinosaurs, a Western theme park instead of an island. But the structure of the catastrophe is the same. Crichton also used the same detail of a systems shutdown that makes things worse. In Westworld, The attempt to cut power seals the control room technicians inside and kills them. In Jurassic Park, Dennis Nedry's sabotage triggers the same cascade. Westworld was where Crichton first mapped that territory, the gap between human ambition and human competence. And he knew it well enough to return to it 20 years later with a different set of animals. Westworld was made for $1.3 million in 30 days, nearly fell apart before it started, and became MGM's biggest hit of 1973. The ending Crichton filmed never made it out of the editing room. The lead actors weren't hired until 2 days before shooting. The studio never showed the film to a single critic, and yet it survived all of it, spending the next 5 decades planting its ideas into every unstoppable screen villain and every story about machines deciding they don't want to stop. The question Crichton was really asking, what does it mean to build something you can no longer control, has only become harder to dismiss with time. If you found this one worth your time, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another look behind the screen at the stories that made what we watched.